Hello, and welcome back to This is What Democracy Looks Like in Italy, hosted by me, Mary Layton. This is the second half of my interview with Frederica and Piero about what it feels like to be a voter in Italy. If you haven't already heard the first part of this interview yet, go back to wherever you found this episode and look for Democracy in Italy Part 1. So, one thing I think is interesting looking at a place like Italy that I'd love to have your opinion on, because it's something it's impossible to see from the outside. We see the picture from the outside of like, oh, there's constantly changing elections, the coalition politics seems crazy, and we hear stories about corruption and clientism. But from the actual on the ground, it's hard to gauge what the level of is there other spaces in which things get done, right? Are there other spaces in which democracy is enacted outside of these kind of official forms? Like, for instance, through journalism, through students, through local neighborhood organizations. If there might be cynicism and there might be corruption, but do things still work? And if so, how?
I would say yes, in general, even though, again, we're speaking of a system that is lowering its ability to really affect a decision to any level. However, I would say that, yes, that is a little bit like Tocqueville used to say, the difference between European parties and American parties, so the big parties and the small parties, etc. Politics is something that you are used to live since you are a teenager in school. You do election in your classroom, because in between the community of 20, 25, 30 people, you need to elect representatives that then they manage the democracy internally. And it is very low level of democracy, because basically it's always the principal that dictates everything happening in the school. But you can participate in the process of decision making. Also, the whole school votes for representatives to go into the in any kind of assembly that there's in school, unless it is to assign grades. They do not participate in grades in grading the students, but any other level of decision making, students have representatives that can say what the students want. That happens in the let's say in the civil society as well, because there's a lot of cooperatives, there's a lot of volunteering, there's many non-profit organizations for everything. There's plenty of organization around that support the introduction. It's just that we used to speak about politics in families in Italy when you were having lunch on a Monday, not even, on big occasions. And right now that is changing towards basically you're chatting about TV shows or things like this. So that's the switch.
But to pull out from what you're saying, what you're talking about sounds like there's a tradition of cooperative organization at every level, which sounds, if I'm going to make a guess, that it comes out of more of a tradition of union cooperative organization, of student cooperative organization, which I would say is absolutely absent in places like the US, which has no tradition of like, okay, all the students are going to get together and be involved in decision making. It's like, no expectation of that, for instance.
Well, tell you something about that, which was my contribution to this question, not being able to provide specific examples of how democracy is acted out outside of elections. But I asked myself, well, indeed, to live here, to live somewhere else must feel differently just for the air you breathe, right? So if this was, many people think that the type of state we have does not affect them, but if it were a dictatorship, it would be different. So somehow it still does, maybe in the air you breathe.
Absolutely.
So I asked myself this question compared to my experience of being in the States or in Belgium. And in fact, again, another indirect answer that I give you, the explanations is somewhere in there, is that I believe that in the United States, there's no tradition of a strong state, centralized state. And I have found a great sense of community in the people.
Oh, really?
People are very proactive in helping each other, or sometimes in doing justice for themselves with, a very strong activism and sense of community in the United States.
Awesome. Yeah.
Very, very much.
Yeah.
Now, in Italy, where I believe the solid, centralized, state that provided unprecedented good welfare for this unprecedented mass of people after World War II and for a couple of decades, developed this sense of there is a state we can trust. We have, healthcare, free education. It's good. The public thing is good.
Yeah.
But then again, it's not in our hands. And now it's falling apart, but we are used to it being there. Yeah. So we don't take action, provided we could. So we complain about the public healthcare system being dismantled, but there's nothing really we can do. Well, there are public protests for this specifically. I give you the different example of Belgium, where I believe that it's not precise, but if you allow me to say this, like Italy a few decades ago. So meaning the welfare is still very, very good. It works very well. Services are good. Taxes are extremely high, but I believe that you get a lot for what you pay for.
Right, exactly. That's the difference. Yeah.
And because they've also had it kind of since World War II, So the good welfare has been in place longer because it maintained itself, and people take it so much for granted that they developed a sense of entitlement, for which they're not fully aware that it's on their shoulders, their responsibility to keep the services going.
Absolutely.
That it's they are a given, and if you try to take some service away from them, they get very French. They complain a lot. They say, how dare you? Yes, how dare you? This is a God-given right, and it's not a God-given right. It's a peak of civilization that we have reached with certain public services. And last cherry on top, I'm going to say, is that I'm bilingual and half Slovenian. Italy and Slovenia belonged for the longest time, Cold War, to the two factions of the world, so different cultures. And I can tell you, I think this matters, but regardless, I saw then in Italy, when something is public, it means it's not yours, it means it's nobody's. So you don't pick up trash from the street if you see like a plastic bottle, because someone else will do it, because it's public, right? It's everybody's, so it's everybody else's. In Slovenia, the public good is everybody's, and that means that it's also mine. Right. So I will pick up that plastic bottle from the ground because it's also mine. And if you see, in both countries, there is the public good, but in one country will be perceived like then someone else will do it. So it's not mine, it's nobody's. Yeah. In the other country, it will be then it's also mine. And I believe that's more the mindset of Germany. That I don't know how it has to do with democracy, but it's in the spirit of people, and it really shows results then in the collective living.
It feels like that would be central to democracy. It feels like it would be central to the whole philosophy of how you get something done.
Absolutely, but there is reason behind for Italy, unfortunately, and it comes from its history, from the end of the Roman Empire until the unification, which is about 14 centuries. And in these 14 centuries, Italy has been a completely divided territory. Sometimes during the era of the early Middle Age, even their cities were one to another's enemy, even though they were just neighbors. And there's a very famous sentence from Massimo d'Azeglio. He used to be the second in charge of Camillo Benso di Cavour, that was the prime minister that planned the unification of Italy in the 1858 and then completed in 60. He basically said, we have completed Italy, now we have to do the Italians. which is amazing.
Yeah.
It has changed a little bit in the last years in both directions, with the usually one other level of democracy where the parties instead themselves. Because you could go to parties, vote for your local representatives, vote for the representatives for the national committee. The national committee would take decision that then would have been discussed up to the last village in Italy. And all of these things were going on when the bigger parties were still on. Right now, I can recall just 2 parties where you can do this in the current situation, while most of the other ones, they're family-like, they're leader-like formations. They might dissolve when the leader goes off, or if a big change kicks in, you know. It's a little bit, they look like a little bit the small parties described by Tocqueville, while we were used to huge organization that even made formation for the new generation to come over and be leaders. They used to have internal schools for that. They don't anymore. On the other hand, the conception of public in the last dozen years or so, it is slightly growing. We can see from KPIs in Italy, but still it's not at the level of Belgium and Slovenia, and that's easy to be reckoned.
Okay, I'm just interrupting here to say that at this point in our conversation, I knew Frederica would have to leave soon, so I had asked my guests if there was anything else we hadn't covered yet that they wanted to bring up.
I'm sure there's something else I could come up with, but I was curious to ask you this question, which is,
please,
if this podcast were about teaching, people around the world how elections or democracy works in other specific countries, you would want to have experts on the show, and you don't. You got us today.
Yes.
What did you get out of this? How it works, or how we feel about it?
Out of desperation, she means.
But this is, what I find, if people wanted to know exactly the structure and the details and the really nitty-gritty things, they could go look on Wikipedia, they could read an article, and there are other podcasts that get that, right? You could get you could go and read a history book or a social science book. But for me, it's interesting seeing the comparative things, right? There's the bits that, like, what does it feel like to actually go into a voting booth? And also the stuff about the actual how people vote is never written about, like the little pencils and stuff like that. And that perspective of the way you vote itself is so rigorous and so security locked down. But what does that mean when the whole system is corrupt? Like, that is fascinating to me. Yeah. And I think when I'm talking to different people about how they feel about paper ballots versus electronic ballots, like, I personally feel that whenever I talk to people, paper ballots paradoxically feel so much more trustworthy than electronic ballots, because you can see it. Like, electronic ballots, you're typing things into a computer, who knows where it goes. I've had friends here in Chicago who type things into a computer. They click on one thing and the computer won't accept it. They click on it again, the computer won't accept it. They press go back, the whole thing voids. They keep going, the whole thing voids. Like, the machines are so buggy. And you're thinking, like, this is an obsolete piece of technology. They're terrible, terrible pieces of machines.
I'm gonna let you laugh.
Yeah.
After. Go, Federica.
Yeah. And the whole thing, when you're voting on an electronic voting machine, it feels like a junky 1980s piece of machinery. It doesn't inspire trust at all. And the whole thing feels like...
Well, there you have it. I mean, all this display of police force and the solemnity of the ritual is probably just a facade to make you trust the system. Says who?
Exactly.
That it's trustworthy. Me personally, I would be so much in favor of televote, digital vote, electronic vote, not on a 1980s PC. There's still, I would be willing to go in and vote on a machine that's there. I would just go from my smartphone. If I could, I'm not making this trivial and easy. I understand the security issues, but I believe that there are comparable security issues.
Absolutely.
Paper ballot. Right.
Yeah.
Imagine, think about it, counting number of clicks, for example, I don't know, on Facebook, are they wrong about the number of likes you have on your posts versus counting by hand millions of pieces of paper? I mean, if you think about it, it doesn't make sense. So I spoke to 2 people before this podcast about this digital vote, because in fact, because we just had to vote last weekend, it was really on my mind. I was like, why isn't this a thing already? And the people who are more expert than I all said, no, security issues are really a big thing. They stand in the way, on top of the skepticism of the largest part of the population, which is a different problem, not technological. Now, I'm, educated in computer science, so it may be my inclination, but I really think that that's the future anyway, because can you see us voting on paper in 200-300 years? If we still vote by then,
we won't.
But this is what's so fascinating, because it comes to the question of trust. Like, and the trust.
I'll say this, speaking of machines, because I don't see how that's very different. A friend of mine in Rochester, New York, the other day, hi David, he said that he remembers, he's now in his 60s, and he remembers when he voted for the first times when he was young, that there was a machine, not electronic, of course, mechanical machine that was counting vote. You went in and they click.
Like the hanging ballot thing. The hanging chads. That was the whole controversy from the Bush election. With the
to guess where I was on that day, in these days.
Where were
wrong
you?
Place.
The closest place to US and the furthest place to the US at the same time.
Cuba.
Yes. And they were having mesa redondas over the election in the US every single night. And it was my first time I was speaking Spanish. I was delighted by listening. I never go out in Cuba in the nights because I was listening to US politics through Cuban commentators.
But the thing I'm getting from comparing all of these countries is there's no one system that's better than the other, right? They're all different and they're all like, but it's just the variety is fascinating to me, because there's we talk about democracy, but the difference in each place is just astounding. Like, and the little tiny things have such enormous implications, like the details of how you vote, or whether it's compulsory, or one of the places in South Korea, like the fact that you have to do national service and therefore a whole generation of men will be in one place or another, really is part of the whole situation about how people vote and when people vote, and is really influential in swaying elections one way. And like small things you'd never expect affect the infrastructure, which then affect the system and then really influence. And that to me is, and we know nothing, like before I started this, knew nothing about all the variety around the world. It's assumed everything was like the UK. Okay, just another little interruption here. Unfortunately, this is where Frederica did leave, but Piero and I continued to talk a little longer, just to explain why you don't hear her from here on out. We're not just, ignoring her or something.
There's 2 things, actually. First, when you consider, I'm absolutely in favor, in theory, over the digital voting, because I believe it's the real way in which you can restart literally coming back to citizens. There's an additional layer of problem to me, though, and it's not only the security, but who's managing the app.
Exactly.
Let's be honest, there's something that due to the differences, you cannot allow a single entity to build up an app that works for everyone.
Exactly.
But every state does not have either the knowledge or the security, nor the investment to go through and build up such an app that has to be bulletproof. And that is key to me, because to be honest, we come from, I didn't live it, but my grandparents and my parents, they lived fascism.
Exactly.
So I have live in my thoughts what were their tales.
Exactly.
And that's absolutely scary. If I think we get on top, I've been 1 month of my life not living but touring Cuba, under Fidel Castro.
Exactly.
And I remember what meant speaking on the street and getting understanding that there are policemen around it. They were doing like the sharks, circling around you, and every circle closer than you. I was in Mexico, living in Mexico for 2 years, and I remember that election of AMLO, and I remember the violence that was before. Actually, the violence that has been on this election as well, because they've had huge problems up to the same election day.
Well, this is one thing actually I wanted to ask you about, because you did have an experience in in Mexico.
Yeah.
Is that's another country that has had a big problem with, in that their sense they call it cartel violence. In Italy, it's like mafia violence, influencing, and trying to figure out how to maintain democracy with that level of just out and out violence. And threats to politicians, threats to journalists, and so on. And when I was talking to my friends from Mexico about that, they cited that as just the biggest threat to maintaining a democratic state. And how, Italy's obviously been dealing with that problem a lot longer. How do you see that in your case?
There is one key thing. You never stop discussing what goes on, what are the threats, what this organization means is a danger to the life of every single individual, because that is true that they don't kill single individual unless there's a huge mistake, and that's very rare. But whatever they do in terms of the economy, that's affecting real entrepreneurs that are investing their money to generate wealth for people, for themselves and for the community. They're affecting elections by purchasing votes, by killing honest candidates. They're influencing the public opinion because they keep under silence, unless there's a brave soul that sometimes, unfortunately, finish buried earlier than expected. There's a lot of issues that generating from the organized crime. There is, though, something that Italy has that Mexico does not have yet, which means we have had heroes, fortunately, that literally fought, and they started putting these people on trial for real. We have had the persons of Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, that were the attorneys that were killed by mafia with some of the most spectacular acts of terrorism. But still, they were able to put 180 people, I believe, behind jail, all of them with life sentence going on. Falcone used to work in the Ministry of Justice, and he was the person behind pushing the legislation for specific mafia regime of incarceration. They couldn't. They had so many restrictions. They couldn't keep commanding their territory while being behind bars, which it is exactly what they used to do. They were partying before it. They were partying in prison. And that is something that it's, unless you start fighting this level, you cannot aspire to a decent level of democracy.
Exactly.
Does it mean that the South, or in general, elections in Italy are 100% clean? No. But I can tell you that when I voted the first time, it was 1993. So we're speaking 31 years ago. and right now, I feel that when I put my cross on top of the symbol, it's much closer to a democratic process than it was 31 years ago. Which, by the way, was the year when they were killed, the year after.
Right. Yeah.
And this means that there is... what I've seen in Mexico, even I used to have a girlfriend by the time, and she's still a very good friend of mine. Their families are made of amazing people. They have enterprises. They are connected with other people. They are absolutely 100% hard worker, honest, God-fearing persons, if we can say so. But they still have this kind of reluctancy that I've seen from Italians to speak openly about that problem. And this is where the organized crime is 200% fruitful, because they can do everything they want, and they can get exposed only where they're shooting in the street. Otherwise, their money is running continuously. That's to me the key. Public opinion exposing everything.
Yeah. Well, that kind of almost provides some hope for other countries that if Italy can move forward and in 30 years there is a difference, then that is kind of a hopeful message. Especially when it seems that the cocaine trade I've been reading is rising so much, and there's an increase in the narcotics violence in Europe in the last couple of years since COVID. So it seems like more countries in Europe are going to be facing this problem.
Well, if you consider what is happening in Holland right now, in Sweden, in Belgium, in let's not speak about northern Spain, but still, at least they're not killing people in the street. But what they used to be, situation under kind of control from the state, they're getting red hot, and they are connected with southern Italian crime. So when Interpol was born, they were not ready to do this. Right now, there's I always think when in my most desperate hour, just to quote Star Wars, A New Hope. In my most desperate hour, I always remember that we have had a decade with Carla Dal Ponte being the head of the tribunal in The Hague. She was the biggest anti-mafia attorney in Switzerland, personal friend of Falcone, and she brought all of that knowledge to the Interpol and intercommunicated level. That is key. If we can fight globally, we can win globally.
No,
otherwise there's no hope, and I believe there is hope.
We have to believe in hope.
Even though I'm much more cynical in my day-to-day conversations.
Well, the question I always ask with, and I'm sorry that Frederica has gone now, is what does democracy mean to you? Do you think you live in a democracy?
I hope I live in the democracy. To me, the meaning of democracy is perfectly described by a quotation of the president of Italy in the early 80s, Sandro Pertini. He used to be a partisan who fought against the Nazis. He used to be one of the founders of the Socialist Party in Italy, and used to be exiled and persecuted by the fascism in Italy. The guy, Sandro Pertini, once said, freedom is the most important thing for democracy, but is not the only foundation. Because freedom without the means of surviving means just that you're free to beg.
Right.
So that is exactly, to me, democracy means that you don't leave anyone behind.
Okay, that about wraps it up. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe, share, or even support it by going to the website www.democracyinpodcast.com. There you can find more information about the topics discussed today, as well as updates. And just a reminder, if you're from a country that hasn't been featured yet and would like to be on the show, drop me a line.